Eva Easton pressed her palms flat against the worn pine surface of the sheriff's desk and looked Deputy David Stone directly in the eyes, and what she said next split the dusty afternoon air of Caldwell, Kansas like a rifle shot. "I am leaving," she said, and her voice did not waver, not even slightly. "Tonight, and I am not coming back, not ever." David Stone did not move. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red sandstone that bordered the Chicaskia River to the south. He had a deputy star pinned to his chest that caught the late October light slanting through the jailhouse window, and for one terrible, suspended moment, he said absolutely nothing. The silence between them was its own kind of violence. Eva had rehearsed this. She had stood in front of the cracked mirror in her room above the Caldwell Mercantile every single morning for the past 2 weeks and rehearsed saying exactly these words, in exactly this order. She had told herself she would be calm. She had told herself she would not let him see how much it cost her to do this, because David Stone had been her hidden weakness for the better part of 2 years, and she could not afford to be weak. Not now, not with what she knew. "Then I am coming with you," David said. Eva had not rehearsed that. She stared at him. The words hit her somewhere below the ribs in that soft, unguarded place she had spent a long time trying to armor up. Her throat tightened. "You cannot come with me," she said. "You have a badge, you have a post. I have nothing," he said, "if you walk out of this town alone." She searched his face for the trap in it. Because she had learned the hard way that when a man said something that sounded like salvation, there was almost always a hidden motive buried somewhere underneath the words, sharp as a Bowie knife and twice as dangerous. Eva Easton had a dark past full of men who had spoken beautifully and meant nothing they said, and she was not going to let that happen again. But David Stone was not looking at her the way those men had looked at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has spent a very long time trying to figure out how to protect. She straightened her spine, gathered the edges of her traveling coat, and walked out the jailhouse door without another word. And he followed her. To understand how 2 people could arrive at a moment like that, standing in the dust of a Kansas cattle town in October of 1878, with everything either of them had ever built suddenly crumbling at their feet, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the day Eva Easton first rode into Caldwell on the southbound stage from Wichita, carrying nothing but a carpet bag, a secret she was running from, and the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that does not come from physical labor, but from the relentless, grinding work of surviving. Caldwell sat right on the edge of the Cherokee Strip, just north of the Indian Territory border, and in the fall of 1878, it was one of the wildest, most lawless towns in Kansas. The cattle drives from Texas still ran straight through it along the Kishom Trail, and the money that came with them brought saloons, gamblers, thieves, and men who believed the law was something that applied to other people. The population was somewhere around 800 souls on a quiet day, and not all of them were the kind of souls you would trust with your back turned. Eva Easton was 24 years old when she stepped off that stage, and she looked, to anyone watching, like a woman who had made a mistake somewhere along the road and was still carrying the weight of it. She was not the kind of beautiful that men shouted at from across a street, but she was the kind of beautiful that made a person look twice, then a third time, because something in her face was impossible to fully read, and human beings are always most compelled by the things they cannot immediately understand. She had dark eyes that held a permanent quality of assessment, like she was constantly measuring the distance between herself and the nearest exit, and her hair was a deep, warm brown that she wore pinned up with an efficiency that suggested she did not have much time for vanity. She had come to Caldwell because she had a position waiting for her at the schoolhouse, arranged through a letter she had written to the town's mayor, a man named Harlan Briggs who ran the general store and served as an informal civic leader. She had references. She had a teaching certificate from a school in Missouri. She had told herself that Caldwell was far enough away from St. Louis that the people she was hiding from would not bother to follow. She had been wrong about that, but she would not find out how wrong for another 6 weeks. The first person she properly met in Caldwell, not counting the stage driver or the boy who grabbed her bag at the station, was David Stone. He was leaning against the post of the stage office when she climbed down, arms folded, watching the new arrivals with the particular expression of a man whose job required him to assess strangers quickly. He was 27 years old, with the kind of lean, capable physicality that came from years of actual physical work rather than performance. He had ridden with a cattle outfit out of San Antonio for 4 years before he ever pinned on a badge, and before that he had grown up on a hardscrabble ranch in the hill country of central Texas, where surviving the land was a daily negotiation that left no room for softness. His dark past was quieter than Eva's, buried deeper, but it was there. It had to do with a man named Cutter Hayes, and it was the reason David Stone had become a lawman in the first place, and it would eventually become the reason he had to walk away from being one. But on that October afternoon, when Eva Easton stepped off the stage with her carpetbag and her careful eyes and her spine held at the precise angle of someone refusing to appear frightened, David Stone simply straightened up from his post and walked over. "Deputy David Stone," he said, and extended his hand. She shook it. Her grip was firm. "Eva Easton, I am here for the schoolteacher position." "I know," he said. "Mayor Briggs asked me to show you where the schoolhouse is and where you will be boarding." She looked at him with that measuring quality, deciding something. "That is very organized of this town," she said, and there was the faintest trace of irony in her voice, because Caldwell, with its muddy main street and its half-dozen saloons and the distant sound of a fiddle playing badly from one of them, did not look like an especially organized place. David almost smiled. "We do our best," he said. He showed her the schoolhouse, which was a solid little building at the east end of town, freshly whitewashed and smelling of new lumber. He showed her the boarding house run by a woman named Mrs. Ida Potts, who was 60, wide, warm, and completely without nonsense. He pointed out the mercantile, the post office, the doctor's office, and the 3 saloons she should avoid entirely, which she thanked him for noting. When they reached the door of the boarding house and he turned to go, she said without looking at him, "You did not ask me where I came from." "No," he said. "Most people do. Most people are fishing," he said. "I figured you would tell me whatever you wanted to tell me." She turned and looked at him then, fully, with that dark, searching gaze that would come to mean a great deal of things to him over time. "That is an unusual philosophy for a lawman," she said. "Maybe," he said, "but it tends to work better than the alternative." She said good evening and went inside, and David Stone walked back down the main street of Caldwell with the particular awareness of a man who has just met someone who is going to matter, and is not entirely sure what to do with that information. Eva's first weeks in Caldwell were defined by the school, which she threw herself into with complete, focused dedication. There were 14 children enrolled, ranging in age from 6 to 15, and they came from cattle families, farming families, the families of shopkeepers and liverymen, and one family of Mexicans who had come up the trail from Chihuahua and settled on a small plot of land east of town. That last family, the Garcias, had a daughter named Rosa who was 10 years old and who had not spoken a single word since her mother died on the trail 2 years prior, and Eva made it her personal mission to reach her. She had a gift for teaching, not the rigid, fearful kind of teaching that relied on threat and punishment, but the kind that came from genuine curiosity about what each child needed in order to unlock something in themselves. She was patient in the classroom in a way she could not always manage outside it, and the children responded to her. Within a month, even Rosa Garcia had begun to raise her hand when she knew the answer to a question, even if she did not yet say the answer out loud. David Stone walked past the schoolhouse most mornings on his way to the sheriff's office, which was 2 blocks west on Main Street. He did not stop. But sometimes he glanced through the window, and sometimes he could hear Eva's voice, clear and steady, explaining something about arithmetic or reading or the history of the Republic, and there was something in the quality of that voice that followed him down the street after he had already passed. They developed a habit of circumstance. Caldwell was a small town. They ate at the same diner on Saturdays because Mrs. Potts did not serve Saturday lunches. They attended the same Sunday services at the Methodist church that had been built that very year on a plot of land donated by a cattle baron who hoped it would improve the town's reputation. They encountered each other at the mercantile, at the post office, occasionally at the edge of the creek on Sunday afternoons when Eva walked to clear her head and David rode out to check the southern approaches to town. They talked about small things, the weather, the price of beef, whether the Methodist minister was actually qualified to preach or simply very confident. They talked about the children Eva taught because she mentioned them often. They did not talk about St. Louis, and they did not talk about Cutter Hayes, and they did not talk about any of the things that lived in the dark interior of either of their lives. But somewhere in those conversations about small things, something began to build between them that was not small at all. It was Eva who first noticed it and tried to dismantle it. She recognized the warmth that had begun to gather in her chest when she heard his name mentioned, or saw his tall figure crossing the street ahead of her, and she identified it clearly for what it was and told herself, with the same firm conviction she used to correct a student's arithmetic, that she was not going to do this. She was not going to let herself need someone in this place, because she did not plan to stay in this place. Caldwell was a bridge, not a destination. She was saving her pay and watching for the moment she could move further west, to Colorado maybe, or the New Mexico territory, somewhere far enough that the shadow following her from St. Louis would finally lose her trail. The shadow had a name. His name was Marcus Holt, and he was 41 years old, and he had been Eva's employer in St. Louis, and the simplest way to describe what he had done to her was that he had made her life a kind of elegant, suffocating imprisonment, and she had finally broken free of it, and he was the kind of man who did not accept that women broke free of him. Marcus Holt was not a violent man in the obvious sense. He was a businessman, charming and respected, with a house on the fashionable side of St. Louis, and a reputation for civic generosity that made him untouchable in polite society. Eva had worked as a governess for his household for 3 years, and in that time he had steadily, methodically worked to ensure that she was completely isolated, financially dependent, and emotionally convinced that she had no viable options. He had never struck her. He had simply made the walls around her tighter and tighter until one day Eva had looked at them and understood with absolute clarity that she had to get out, or she would disappear inside those walls entirely. She had left in the middle of the night with the contents of her savings hidden in the lining of her carpet bag, and she had gone first to Wichita because it was the furthest west the railway ran without going through St. Louis, and then to Caldwell because it was further still. She had told no one in Caldwell any of this, not Mrs. Potts, not Mayor Briggs, not David Stone, but in the first week of December, a writer came to town who made her hands go cold. She was leaving the school at the end of the day when she saw him. He was standing outside the saloon called the Red Flag, a man in a dark suit that was too fine for Caldwell, talking to one of the gamblers who frequented the place. She did not recognize the man himself, but she recognized the type. He was the kind of man Marcus Holt sent to find things that had gone missing from his possession. She had seen that look before, that particular quality of stillness and professional attention, like a man cataloging information for later use. She walked back to the boarding house without changing her pace, but her heart was beating very fast. That night, alone in her room, Eva made the decision that she would not run again immediately. Running too fast, too desperately, left a trail. She would continue as normal, continue teaching, continue keeping her eyes open, and she would make a careful plan. What she had not accounted for was David Stone. He noticed the change in her the very next morning. He noticed because he had, by this point, become accustomed to the specific quality of Eva Easton's composure, the way she held herself, the rhythm of how she moved through a day, and something in it was different. She was still controlled, still precise, but there was a new tension underneath it, like a watch wound too tight. He found a reason to walk past the schoolhouse twice that afternoon. On the second pass, she was standing on the step looking at the main street with an expression he could not name, and when she heard his boots on the path she turned sharply, in a way she would not have turned 6 weeks ago. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "You do not look it. Deputy Stone, I am not in the habit of broadcasting my internal states for public assessment." "I know," he said. "That is why I am asking." She looked at him. He looked back. The December wind moved down the main street between them, carrying a smell of coal dust and wood smoke. "There is a man in town," she said finally, "that I would prefer not to be noticed by." She had not planned to say even that much. But David Stone had a quality of patient steadiness that made things slip out, made you feel like your words were safe with him. He did not ask who the man was. He did not ask why. He simply said, "I will keep an eye on him." "You do not need to." "I am the deputy," he said simply. "It is my job to keep an eye on strangers in town." She gave him a long look. "You are a complicated man," she said. "Not particularly," he said, and walked away. He was, of course, lying. He was very complicated. The badge on his chest was the outward evidence of a set of convictions that had been forged in pain and loss, and he wore it with an intensity that most people mistook for ambition, but was actually something closer to penance. The man he had mentioned only to himself, Cutter Hayes, had been the foreman of the cattle outfit David rode with out of San Antonio. Hayes was brutal in the specific, organized way of men who have learned to disguise brutality as discipline. He had ruled that outfit through a combination of fear and manipulation, and David, at 21, had been young enough and desperate enough for belonging that he had looked away from things he should not have looked away from. He had said nothing when Hayes cheated a Mexican family out of their cattle on the trail. He had said nothing when a younger drover was beaten half to death for losing a steer. He had stayed quiet and done his work and told himself it was not his business. And then a man had died. A good man, a drover named James Webb, who had finally stood up to Hayes at the wrong moment. And David had been close enough to intervene and had not done it fast enough. And James Webb had died of his injuries 2 days later in an Abilene rooming house. David had quit the outfit the day James Webb died. He had walked directly to the marshal's office in Abilene and told them everything he knew about Cutter Hayes, and Hayes had eventually been arrested, tried, and sentenced to 8 years in the Kansas penitentiary. But the knowledge of what his silence had cost, the understanding that his failure to act had been a kind of complicity, had never left him. He had pinned on a badge because he had made himself a promise. The promise was that he would not look away again. He was keeping an eye on the man in the fine suit before the sun went down on the day Eva told him about the stranger. The man's name, David learned through the patient application of casual conversation at the Red Flag Saloon, was Reeves Doyle. He had come up from Wichita on the stage. He was asking questions, specifically asking questions about a woman traveling alone who might have passed through in recent months, a teacher, dark-haired, from St. Louis. He was offering money for good information. David spent a very long moment behind the jailhouse in the cold evening air, processing this. Then he went to see Eva. She opened the boarding house door at his knock and looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes, and he said, "His name is Reeves Doyle. He is asking about a dark-haired woman from St. Louis who might be working as a teacher. He is offering money." The color went out of Eva Easton's face, and for one unguarded moment David could see everything she had been hiding, all the fear and the exhaustion and the desperate, grinding weight of being hunted. Then the composure came back over her features like a curtain closing, but it was too late. He had already seen it. "Come inside," she said. "I need to tell you something." She told him about Marcus Holt. Not all of it, not the parts that lived in the deepest, most private rooms of her experience, but enough. She told him about the employment, the isolation, the suffocating control. She told him she had left in the night. She told him that Marcus Holt did not accept being left. David listened without interrupting. When she was done, the room was very quiet, and she was sitting with her hands folded in her lap in the posture of someone who has said something difficult and is now waiting for judgment. There was no judgment in his face. "Why Caldwell?" he asked. "I needed a teaching position that was far enough away. I had the certificate. The mayor's letter was encouraging." She paused. "I believed I had gone far enough." "You may need to go further," he said. "I know. But not tonight," he said. "Tonight I am going to have a conversation with Mr. Doyle that will make him reconsider the wisdom of staying in this particular town." "You cannot arrest a man for asking questions," she said. "No," he said. "But I can make very clear that he is being watched, that the sheriff and I are aware of his presence and his activities, and that Caldwell does not take kindly to men who have come to harass its residents." He stood. "Men like Doyle work best when they are invisible. They do not like being known." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp on the table cast a warm, wavering light across the room, and she was very still. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He picked up his hat. "Because it is my job," he said. She watched him go, and she knew, with the particular clarity of a woman who had spent years learning to recognize the difference between what people said and what they meant, that he was not doing it entirely because of his job. She also knew she was not going to let herself think too much about what that meant. Reeves Doyle left Caldwell on the stage to Wichita 3 days later. David had not needed to do much beyond making his presence felt, confirming in plain terms to Doyle that he had been identified and was being watched, and reminding him in the politely worded but entirely unambiguous language of a lawman that Caldwell was a community that protected its own. Doyle was not a fighter. He was a finder, and he did not like being found himself. He went. But he went back to Marcus Holt, and Marcus Holt was not the kind of man who gave up. What followed was 2 months of relative peace, and in those 2 months, despite every resolution she had made, Eva Easton fell in love with David Stone. It did not happen in a single moment. It happened in the accumulation of small things, in the particular texture of their growing friendship, which was unlike any friendship she had had before because it was built on a foundation of genuine mutual respect, rather than the usual performance that passed for human connection in her experience. It happened in the evenings when they sat in the front parlor of the boarding house with Mrs. Potts asleep in her chair and talked about books, because they had both read widely and differently, and their conversations had the satisfying quality of two people discovering a new country together. Eva had read a great deal of philosophy and history. David had read more novels than she expected, and he had opinions about them that were sharp and unexpected. He thought Charles Dickens was the finest moral writer of the age, but found his coincidences implausible. She thought Dickens' moral vision was too sentimental. They disagreed pleasantly for the better part of an evening about this, and when she went upstairs to bed she was smiling in a way she had not smiled in a very long time. It happened in January when a norther blew through, and the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and Eva arrived at the schoolhouse to find the stove had gone cold, and she could not get it started. David appeared 20 minutes later as if he had known, and built the fire with a calm efficiency that had all 14 children watching him with pure fascination. He stayed long enough to ensure the room was warm, nodded to Eva, and left, and Rosa Garcia, who had still not spoken aloud, looked at the door he had walked out and then looked at Eva and wrote something on her slate. Eva walked over to read it. It said, "He is a good man." Eva had agreed with the slate very quietly to herself, and then set the class to their reading. It happened in February when Eva found a letter in her room that she had not expected, slipped under her door in the night. It was from Marcus Holt, and it was written in the smooth, controlled language of a man who believed his own authority was absolute and self-evident. He said she had embarrassed him. He said he was prepared to be generous in his forgiveness if she returned immediately. He said the alternative would be deeply unpleasant for her. He said he had certain information about her that he was willing to share with the community of Caldwell, certain information about her history in St. Louis, that he believed would destroy her reputation in this small, morally traditional town, and that he was giving her the opportunity to make the wise choice before he was forced to be unkind. Eva sat on the edge of her bed with the letter in her hands, and the old fear moved through her, cold and deep as a river in March. She understood exactly what he meant. The information he was referring to was the truth of her circumstances in St. Louis, the truth that she had not merely been a governess but had for a time, during the deepest and most desperate point of her isolation, been kept by Marcus Holt in a capacity that was not professional, a truth she had never chosen and had endured only because he had made it clear she had no other options. A truth that any church-going community in 1879 would use to destroy her regardless of the circumstances that had produced it. She burned the letter in the lamp flame. Then she sat in the dark for a long time. She thought about leaving. She thought about packing the carpetbag, slipping out of Caldwell in the gray pre-dawn, moving further west. But she thought about the schoolhouse and the children and Rosa Garcia's slate, and something in her rebelled against it. She had spent 3 years letting Marcus Holt move her like a piece on a board. She was done being moved. But she also knew she could not fight what he was threatening from inside Caldwell alone. She did not go to David that night. But she spent the next week paying very close attention to the people around her, watching for any sign that Holt had made good on his threat, that someone had been told something, that a look had changed or a tone had shifted. Nothing happened. Holt was still circling, still positioning, and the letter had been a pressure tactic rather than an immediate action. And in that week of heightened, anxious watchfulness, she found herself more aware of David than she had ever let herself be. She found herself noting the particular way he moved through a room, the economy of it, the absence of any wasted gesture. She found herself, in the middle of explaining long division to her oldest students, thinking about something he had said the previous evening about the quality of justice possible in a frontier town, something complicated and thoughtful and not at all what she had expected him to say. She found herself, one afternoon in late February, walking into the sheriff's office with absolutely no plan for what she was going to say, and sitting down across the desk from him, and telling him about the letter. He listened. He did not say anything immediately when she finished. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, the way he did when he was thinking carefully, and then he said, "He is using your past as a weapon." Yes, the circumstances of your past in St. Louis. He said it carefully, making clear he was not asking for details. The things he is threatening to reveal. Yes, he believes they will ruin you here. He may be right, she said. This is a small, very traditional community. The details of what I endured in that house, she stopped. People rarely care about the context of a woman's choices, only the choices themselves. David Stone looked at her for a long time. His expression was very still, which did not mean, she had learned, that he was unmoved. It meant the opposite. "Eva," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name, and the way he said it was different from the way anyone else had ever said it. "Whatever Marcus Holt tells anyone in this town about you, it is not going to change anything that matters." She opened her mouth to argue because she was a practical woman and she understood the social mechanics of the situation very clearly. "I will not argue about this," he said quietly before she could speak. "I am telling you what is true." She looked at him across the desk of the small, dusty sheriff's office with the winter light coming thin and cold through the window, and something happened in her chest that she had not fully given herself permission for, a deep, irresistible recognition, the feeling of seeing someone clearly and being clearly seen in return, which is the most frightening and most beautiful thing that can happen between two people. She stood up. "Thank you," she said, and her voice was not quite even. "I will find out how Holt is sending his communications into town," he said, back to the matter at hand, the practical man again. "If he is using couriers, I want to know who they are." "All right," she said. She went back to the school, and she sat at her desk after the children had gone home and allowed herself, for the first time, to fully acknowledge that she was in love with David Stone, and that this was absolutely terrible timing, and that she was going to have to figure out what to do about it. March came in cold and stayed that way, and David found the courier. It was a young man, barely 19, who had been paid $1 in Wichita to ride down to Caldwell and deliver letters to a certain boarding house when instructed. The young man was not a criminal, just poor and willing, and David let him go with a firm explanation of why delivering letters for Marcus Holt was not in his long-term interest. The courier went north and did not come back, but Marcus Holt escalated. In mid-March, 2 men arrived in Caldwell on horseback who were not the type to ask polite questions. They were the type who did not need to ask questions because they had already been given answers, and they had come to act on them. They were staying at the least reputable of the town's boarding establishments, and within the first day of their arrival, David Stone had cataloged them completely. He went to Eva that evening with a directness that left no room for softening. "Holt has sent men," he said. "Not couriers this time, men." Eva went very still. "How many?" "2, named Greer and Pitt. If the register is accurate, I doubt it is." He watched her face. "They have not made a move yet. They may be waiting for orders or waiting for an opportunity." "He wants me back," she said. "Not hurt. He is not that kind of man. He is the kind who needs to win, and winning means having me back where I was." "He is still that kind of man," David said quietly. "Forcing someone back against their will is not a gentle act, regardless of his preference for not using fists." She met his eyes. He was right. She knew he was right. "What do we do?" she asked. "I have told the sheriff," he said. "Sheriff Maddox agrees that we have grounds to watch them closely and to give them notice that they are known. But Eva, if they are determined and Holt has enough money behind them, there is a limit to what I can legally do before they actually commit an offense." "I know," she said. And then, without having fully decided to say it, she said, "I have been thinking about going further west, Colorado. Maybe as far as Santa Fe." The room was very quiet. "When?" he asked. "When I have enough saved. Another 3 months, maybe 4. He nodded slowly. He did not say anything about the space between now and 3 months from now, about what could happen in that space. "We will get through it," he said. She wanted to ask him what he meant by we, but she was a woman who had built very careful walls around her deepest wants, and so she let the word go without grabbing it. The next 2 weeks were a sustained exercise in tension. Greer and Pitt stayed in Caldwell, spending their days at the saloon and their evenings at cards, and they were watched every moment they were visible. David made his presence conspicuous. He walked past their boarding house. He drank coffee at the establishment adjacent to the saloon and made sure they saw him see them. He was not subtle about any of it because he did not want to be. He wanted them uncomfortable. He wanted them to report back to Holt that operating in Caldwell was not going to be easy. And then one morning in late March, Eva went to the schoolhouse and found it had been entered in the night. Nothing was destroyed, nothing was stolen, but her desk had been opened and her papers had been gone through. It was a message. It was Holt saying, "I can reach you wherever you are." David's expression when she told him was very controlled, but she had learned to read the particular quality of his stillness, and she knew he was angry in the quiet, deep way that was more dangerous than noise. "He is trying to frighten you," David said. "He is succeeding," she said plainly. "What do you need?" She looked at him. "I need to stop being frightened," she said. "I am tired of being frightened. I have been frightened for 3 years and I am absolutely finished with it." Something shifted in his expression. Something opened, briefly, in the carefully controlled terrain of his face. "Good," he said, and there was a warmth in his voice that she felt in her whole body. She acted the following morning. She went to the sheriff's office first thing and made a formal statement about the intrusion into the schoolhouse. She wrote a letter to the Wichita City Marshal describing Marcus Holt and his pattern of harassment and identifying his hired men by name. She made copies of the letter and sent them to 3 separate places so that no single interception could erase it. She did all of this with David beside her, not doing it for her but present, witnessing, a steady and solid presence at her right hand. Then she walked back to the schoolhouse and opened it for the day, and she taught arithmetic and reading and the history of the state of Kansas to 14 children, as if the world outside those whitewashed walls were not complicated at all. Greer and Pitt left town a week later. David never knew exactly what had prompted the departure. Maybe the formal letter to the Wichita Marshal had reached someone who mattered. Maybe Holt had calculated that the cost of maintaining 2 men in Caldwell was not worth the result. Maybe the relentless pressure of David's visible, documented attention had simply made the operation untenable. Whatever the reason, they were gone on a Tuesday morning in early April, and the town resumed its normal rhythms. The spring that followed was the most complicated and most beautiful period of Eva Easton's life. The threat had receded, but she knew with absolute certainty that it had not been permanently resolved, because Marcus Holt did not resolve things, he merely postponed them. She continued saving her pay. She continued teaching, and the teaching had deepened since the winter, had become more layered and meaningful, because she had stopped holding herself at the careful distance of someone who does not plan to stay. She had let herself care about these children fully, and the result was that the school had become a genuinely remarkable little institution, known throughout the surrounding farms and ranches as the place where children actually wanted to go. Rosa Garcia spoke her first word aloud in April. She said it in the middle of a reading lesson. The word was window, a word in a book she was reading about a girl looking out at the sea, and she said it clearly and quietly, and the whole classroom went very still, and Eva had to look away for a moment because her eyes had filled. David came by that afternoon and Eva told him, and he smiled genuinely with his whole face, which she had seen him do perhaps 4 times before, and it did something entirely unreasonable to her composure. "You did that," he said. "Rosa did it," she said. "Eva," he said, and again, the particular way he said her name. "You gave her a safe enough place to do it." They were standing on the step of the schoolhouse in the April sun, and the prairie around Caldwell was beginning to go green at the edges, and the cottonwoods along the creek were putting out their first leaves, small and yellow-green and trembling. The sky was very wide and very blue. There was a moment, one of those unguarded moments, where neither of them looked away, and the air between them was full of something that had been building for months and was now very close to the surface. Then one of her students came running back because he had forgotten his reader, and the moment broke, and they both stepped back a fraction, and Eva straightened her already straight spine, and David nodded and walked away, and the spring afternoon continued around them as if nothing enormous had nearly happened. But it was there. It was entirely, undeniably there. He kissed her for the first time in May. They had been walking along the bank of the Chicaskia River on a Sunday afternoon, something they had done together 3 or 4 times now, because the river path south of town was one of the only places in Caldwell where you could walk without being part of the town's constant social performance, and both of them needed that sometimes. They had been talking about nothing important, the kinds of easy, comfortable things you talk about when the underlying conversation is about something else entirely. And then she said something. She was never afterward able to remember exactly what. Something about the quality of light on the water, and he stopped walking and turned to look at her, and his expression was the most undefended she had ever seen it. All the layers of competence and control stripped back to something simpler and more essential. And she thought with a clarity that cut straight through everything, "Oh, he loves me." He said, "Eva." She said, "David." And he kissed her, They're on the bank of the Chicaskia River in the May sunshine, with the cottonwood fluff drifting through the air like a strange pale snow. And it was the kind of kiss that has nothing performative in it, nothing calculated, nothing to do with anything except two people finally crossing a threshold that has been there for a very long time. She kissed him back with everything she had been careful to keep back for months, and when they finally separated, she pressed her forehead against his chest and felt his hand come up to the back of her head, holding her carefully, as if she were something he was very glad to have in his hands and did not intend to drop. "I have been trying not to do that for 7 months," he said. "I know," she said against his chest. "Were you trying not to do it too?" She lifted her head and looked up at him. "I was trying very hard," she said. He was looking at her with an expression of such open, uncomplicated happiness that it made something ache in her. She reached up and touched his face with one hand, and he turned his head slightly and pressed his lips to her palm, and the intimacy of it was more than she had been prepared for. They walked back to town in the late afternoon with their hands loosely linked between them, not talking much, both of them adjusting to this new thing that had happened, this shift in the landscape of their shared life. The summer of 1879 in Caldwell was hot and busy and full of the noise of the cattle drives, and for the space of it, Eva Easton was happier than she had been in a very long time. She and David moved carefully, appropriately for the time and place, mindful of the town's observant community. There was nothing hidden or shameful about their courtship, but they were also both people who guarded their interior lives carefully, and so the depth of what was between them was something only they fully knew. He walked her to the school every morning. She brought him coffee on slow afternoons at the sheriff's office. On Sunday evenings they sat on the front porch of the boarding house and talked until the stars came out, and Mrs. Potts brought them lemonade and pretended not to be delighted. They talked about real things now, the dark pasts, the hidden places. She told him about the worst of it, about the powerlessness, about the way Marcus Holt had dismantled her sense of her own agency piece by piece, slowly enough that she had not seen it happening until it was nearly complete. He listened without looking away. He did not offer easy reassurances. He simply received what she told him and held it with the same care he would have held anything precious. He told her about James Webb, about the cattle outfit, about Cutter Hayes, about the specific quality of his own cowardice that had cost a good man his life. She listened in the same way. She did not say it was not his fault. She said, "You changed," and he said, "I tried to," and she said, "You did." He had never felt as known by anyone as he felt by Eva Easton, and the experience of being known, of having someone see the worst thing about himself and not flinch, undid something in him that he had not known was still held tight. In August, he asked her to marry him. They were sitting on the boarding house porch in the evening heat, and he did it with a directness that was entirely characteristic of him. No elaborate staging, just a quiet, serious question, and Eva understood that the seriousness of it was his way of honoring the seriousness of her. She said yes. She did not hesitate, and she noticed the absence of hesitation and knew what it meant. She had stopped planning to leave, or she thought she had. Marcus Holt's shadow reached Caldwell again in September. This time it was not a courier or hired men. This time it was a letter addressed to the mayor, to the members of the Methodist Church Board, and to 3 of the most prominent ranching families in the area. It contained, in the smooth, controlled language of a respectable businessman communicating a community concern, a detailed account of Eva Easton's situation in his St. Louis household. He framed it, of course, in the language of moral concern, of a man saddened to inform the decent people of a frontier community that the woman entrusted with the education of their children had engaged in conduct unbecoming a schoolteacher and a woman of character. The letters arrived on a Thursday. By Friday morning, Eva knew. She knew because Mayor Briggs came to the school in the morning and asked to speak with her privately, and his expression told her everything before he said a single word. He was not a cruel man, Harlan Briggs. He was a careful man, a man who managed Caldwell's reputation with the same precision that he managed his stock inventory, and he was troubled. He did not fire her on the spot. He said the matter needed to be considered. He said there would be a meeting of the school board the following Monday. He was sorry to bring this to her. He was sorry for the difficulty of the situation. He left, and Eva stood in the empty schoolhouse for a long time after the door closed behind him. The children arrived at their usual time, and she taught them with her usual steadiness, and none of them knew that anything had changed, and only Rosa Garcia, who was perceptive beyond her years, watched Eva with quiet, careful eyes all day. When school was done, Eva went back to her room. She sat on the bed. She thought with absolute, cold clarity about what was going to happen. She thought about the school board meeting. She thought about the way communities like this one worked, the way a woman's reputation, once damaged in a certain direction, could rarely be fully repaired in the eyes of the people who mattered for her livelihood. She thought about the fact that even if David stood by her, which she did not doubt for a single moment, his support might not be enough. She thought about the teaching certificate and all the work she had done in this town, and the children, and Rosa Garcia, and then she stopped thinking about that because it was too painful. She thought about Marcus Holt, and for the first time in months she felt the old fear rise in her again, cold and specific. And beneath the fear was something new. Beneath it was a rage so clean and clarifying that it almost felt like purpose. She was not going to let him have this. She was not going to sit in this room and wait for Monday's meeting to confirm what she already knew. She was not going to stay in Caldwell and watch what he had built be taken from her piece by piece. She was going to leave. She decided it completely and finally, sitting on the edge of her bed in the September light. She would leave before Monday. She would go west. As she had always intended, she would find a new position in a place Marcus Holt had no reach. She would build something new. She would not let him win by staying in the place he was burning down. She got up and began to pack. And then she stopped. Because David Stone was out there in that town with his badge and his daily rounds and his patient certainty, and she owed him the truth of what she was doing. She went to the jailhouse. She pressed her palms flat against the worn pine surface of the sheriff's desk and looked Deputy David Stone directly in the eyes, and she told him she was leaving, tonight, forever, not coming back. And he said, "Then I am coming with you." She stared at him. The words hit her somewhere below the ribs. "You cannot come with me," she said. "You have a badge, you have a post. I have nothing," he said, "if you walk out of this town alone." She searched his face for the trap in it, for the hidden motive, because Eva Easton had a dark past full of men who had spoken beautifully and meant nothing. But David Stone was not looking at her the way those men had looked at her. He was looking at her the way a man looks at something he has spent a very long time trying to protect. "David," she said, and her voice cracked just slightly. "You cannot sacrifice your position here. You cannot, Eva." He was around the desk in 3 steps, standing directly in front of her, close enough that she could see the small details of his face, the old scar along his jaw from a fall in his cattle-driving days, the particular dark brown of his eyes that was almost black in low light. "Marcus Holt sent those letters to destroy you, and you are planning to give him exactly what he wants by running." "I am planning to survive," she said. "You can do both," he said, "but not alone, not the way you have been alone." He reached up and took her face in his hands, gently, in the way he had of being gentle that always surprised her given his size and the roughness of his work. "I made you a promise when I asked you to marry me. I intend to keep it, however we have to do that, wherever we have to do it." "You would leave this town," she said, "leave this badge." "I have been thinking about leaving this town since July," he said, and she saw in his expression that this was true, that he had been sitting with this quietly, the way he sat with everything, turning it over and examining it until he was certain. "I have served out here for 4 years. I have done what I set out to do. I do not need to do it here for the rest of my life." He paused. "And if you are in Colorado or Santa Fe, then I need to be there too. It is very simple." She looked at him for a long, long moment. She thought about the walls she had built. She thought about how hard she had worked to not need anyone, to not let herself be the kind of woman who could be undone by a man's presence or destroyed by his absence. She thought about all of that, and she thought about what Rosa Garcia had written on her slate, and she thought about James Webb and the promise David Stone had made himself about not looking away again. Then she stopped thinking and let herself feel it, the full, tremendous weight of loving this man, of trusting him, of choosing him. "All right," she said. "Then we go together." He kissed her once, quickly and firmly, the way you seal a decision. Then they moved fast. David went to see Sheriff Maddox that evening. He did not make it dramatic. He said he was resigning his post effective immediately and gave a reason that was honest without being complete. There were personal matters requiring him to leave Caldwell, and he had made his decision. Maddox was a fair man, older, experienced, and he looked at David for a long moment and said, "Does this have anything to do with Miss Easton and those letters?" "It has everything to do with Miss Easton," David said. "And we are not running. We are making a choice." Maddox nodded slowly. He shook David's hand. "You were a good deputy," he said. "Better than you think." David said goodbye to two men in town who were something close to friends, a blacksmith named Porter Hale and an older cattleman named McGrew who had mentored him informally in his first year. He said nothing to the church board or to anyone associated with the letters. He owed them no explanation. Eva had gone back to the boarding house and finished packing, quietly and efficiently, and she had sat with Mrs. Potts and told her the truth, all of it. Mrs. Potts had listened with her hands folded in her wide lap, and when Eva finished she said, "You should have told me sooner. I would have helped." Then she stood up and packed a sizable quantity of preserved foods and wrapped it firmly in a cloth and told Eva it was for the journey. Then she embraced Eva with the solid warmth of a woman who had been waiting to do so for some time, and Eva held on for a moment longer than she intended. In the morning, Eva went to the school before anyone else was there. She sat at her desk one last time. She wrote a long letter to each of her students, sealed in individual envelopes addressed to their homes, a letter about what they were capable of and what she hoped for them. She wrote a separate letter to Rosa Garcia's father, telling him what Rosa had accomplished and asking him to ensure she continued to be given access to books. She left the letters in a neat stack on the desk. Then she walked out and closed the door behind her. David had hired a good wagon from the livery and two solid horses, bay geldings, well-muscled and reliable. He had enough money saved from 4 years of a deputy's salary, and Eva had her own savings, and together they had what they needed for a serious journey west. He had packed tools, a good rifle and ammunition, blankets, a tent, cooking equipment, and enough food for several weeks of travel, with the assumption that they would resupply in larger settlements along the way. They left Caldwell on a gray October morning, heading southwest toward the Indian Territory border, and then west along the stage road toward Colorado. The prairie was enormous around them, flat and stretching to every horizon, and the sky above it was the kind of high, cold blue that you only get in October on the southern plains. Eva sat beside David on the wagon seat with her traveling coat buttoned to the chin and the carpetbag at her feet that she had carried all the way from St. Louis. And as the outline of Caldwell's rooftops shrank behind them, she did not look back. She put her hand in David's, on the seat between them, and he closed his fingers around it without looking away from the road. They were 3 days southwest of Caldwell when David made the decision about Marcus Holt that he had been quietly working out for the entire journey. He had been thinking about it since September, since Eva told him about the letters, about the sustained campaign of a man who believed that women were things he could own and retrieve at will. He had thought about his own history, about the things he had stayed quiet about too long, and he had made himself a promise. "I want to deal with this properly," he said, on the second evening, while they sat beside the fire with the prairie dark and wide around them. "Not just run from it." Eva looked at him. The firelight was on his face. "What do you mean?" "Holt is violating federal law," he said. "Interstate harassment, hired men entering private property. He has been conducting a campaign of intimidation across state lines. There are federal marshals who handle exactly this kind of case. You think they would take it seriously? If it is documented properly," he said, "and presented to the right person, yes. I have contacts in Wichita and in Kansas City from my time as a deputy. One of those contacts works under a federal circuit judge." He paused. "I want to send a formal complaint before we go any further. Documented, signed, with copies sent to multiple offices so that it cannot be quietly buried." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "And if it works?" "Marcus Holt is facing federal scrutiny instead of operating freely, and the risk of him continuing to come after you goes from certain to very unlikely. He is a businessman first. He will not risk his reputation and his freedom indefinitely." She looked at the fire. "And if it does not work, then we are in Colorado regardless," he said, "and we are together and we will figure out what comes next." She turned and looked at him in the firelight. "You thought all of this out already?" "I have had 3 days. David Stone," she said, and there was a warmth in her voice that she no longer attempted to moderate. "You are the most thoroughly considered man I have ever encountered." He looked at her with a quality of attention that she would never get entirely used to, even when she had known him for years, that feeling of being fully, completely seen. "I love you," he said. He had said it twice before. Each time it was as unadorned and direct as a declaration could be, no performance to it, simply the true thing. "I love you," she said back. They slept under the immense prairie sky with the horses picketed nearby and the fire burning down to coals, and in the morning they continued west. On the 4th day of travel, they stopped in a small settlement called Arroyo Blanco, which was barely more than a trading post and a cluster of adobe buildings at a crossroads. There was a telegraph office. David sent his documented complaint to 3 separate federal offices, one in Wichita, one in Kansas City, and one in Topeka, where a federal circuit judge named Harmon had been known to take cases of interstate crime seriously. He sent his own name, his 4 years' service record as a deputy in Caldwell, and the complete documented account of Marcus Holt's activities. Then they continued west. The journey to Trinidad, Colorado took 11 days total, and it was some of the most difficult and the most quietly joyful time of Eva's life. The land changed as they moved west, the flat, endlessly repeating Kansas plains giving way gradually to a rougher terrain, the sky seeming to grow even larger somehow, the distances between things becoming more pronounced. They crossed the Arkansas River at a ford near the Kansas-Colorado border, the horses wading through the cold, shallow current with their heads up and their ears forward, and Eva gripped the wagon seat and felt the cold spray on her face and laughed, for no specific reason except that she was out in the enormous American West with a man she loved, and she was completely, bone-deep free. David looked at her when she laughed, and his expression was that rare, open, unguarded happiness she had seen only a handful of times. They talked for those 11 days the way people talk when they have a great deal of road and no particular urgency, the way you can only talk in transit, when the movement of the world around you loosens something in the interior world. He told her more about his years on the cattle trail, the parts that were genuinely beautiful, the massive night skies over Texas and the quality of silence at 3 in the morning when it was your watch and the cattle were settled, and there was nothing in the world but you and the stars. She told him about her girlhood in Missouri, which had been genuinely happy before it got complicated, about her mother who had taught her to love books and her father who had been a kind man undone by bad luck. She told him about why she had become a teacher, because the 1 year she had spent in a proper school as a child had been the 1 year she felt entirely like herself. He listened to all of it. She loved him more with every mile. They arrived in Trinidad, Colorado in mid-October of 1879, and it was a real town, larger and more established than Caldwell, settled in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, with a quality of permanence that Caldwell, with its cattle boom impermanence, had never quite achieved. There were proper brick buildings here, a courthouse, several churches, a school that had been in continuous operation since 1870. They went first to the justice of the peace, because David wanted them to be married before they looked for work or property, and Eva wanted that too, with a simplicity and certainty that surprised her after all the years she had spent being carefully self-sufficient. The justice of the peace was a compact, cheerful man named Abernathy who married them in the morning in his office, with 2 witnesses pulled in from the street, and when David kissed her afterward, it was with the same steady, unhurried certainty with which he did everything, and Eva held onto his lapels with both hands and kissed him back. They were married in October of 1879 in Trinidad, Colorado, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains visible through the window, and everything they owned was in a wagon outside. David found work within the first week. He was not looking for a lawman's position this time. He had spoken with a land agent about a property, a small ranch to the east of Trinidad where the land was good and the price was negotiable, and he needed capital for it. He took a position with the local freighting company, managing their southwestern routes, which paid well and suited his particular combination of organizational skill and knowledge of the territory. He was methodical and reliable, and the freighting company knew what it had within a month of hiring him. Eva applied for a position at the Trinidad school and was met with the kind of interview she had been through twice before: the school board, the questions about her credentials and experience, the careful evaluation of a woman who wanted to teach their children. She answered everything directly, including, when asked, the fact that she had left her previous position and the town of Caldwell under complicated circumstances. She said it plainly, without apology, and explained what had produced those circumstances, and she sat across the table from the 5 members of the Trinidad School Board and looked each of them in the face. They hired her. She started teaching in November. In January of 1880, a letter arrived from the Federal Circuit Office in Topeka. It was addressed to David Stone, former deputy, Caldwell, Kansas, forwarded through the Trinidad Post. It informed him that the case against Marcus Holt had been reviewed by the Federal Circuit and that an investigation had been opened. The letter was formal and measured, but its meaning was clear. Marcus Holt was being looked at by people who had the authority and the interest to look at him seriously. Eva read the letter 3 times. Then she set it on the table and sat very still for a moment. "It is not over," she said. "No," David said, "but it is no longer just you against him. There are federal eyes on him now, and he is a man who cannot afford federal eyes, not with his business interests. He will be careful. Yes, that is what we want. We want him to be so careful that he leaves you alone." She thought about this. She thought about the particular texture of Marcus Holt's need to control, the way it worked, the way a man like that calculated risk. Federal scrutiny was not a risk he would be willing to accept indefinitely. His power came from the appearance of respectability, and federal investigations destroyed respectability. "He will let it go," she said, and she believed it as she said it. "I think so too," David said. She did not receive another letter from Marcus Holt. She did not receive another courier, another hired man, another communication of any kind. The federal investigation in Topeka expanded, and within 8 months Marcus Holt was formally charged with several counts of interstate fraud unrelated to Eva, business practices that the scrutiny of his activities had uncovered, and he was fully consumed with his own legal troubles. He had no more attention to spare for a woman who had escaped him and settled in Colorado with a former deputy who was, by all accounts, quietly formidable. Eva Easton Stone was free. The ranch to the east of Trinidad became real in the spring of 1880. David had saved enough from his freighting work combined with Eva's teaching income, and the land agent had held the property through the winter as promised. It was 40 acres of decent grazing land with a creek running through the lower quarter, and an existing house that needed significant work. They spent their evenings and weekends through the spring making it livable, a project that turned out to be as genuinely enjoyable as it was practical, because Eva had a decisive eye for how space should function and David had the skills to realize whatever she decided. And the process of building something together turned out to be one of the finest things about being with a person you loved. They had a vegetable garden by May. They had 2 additional horses, a cow named Tuesday for the day she arrived, and 4 chickens. They had a porch that David built in June that ran the full width of the front of the house, and on summer evenings they sat on it and watched the light change on the mountains to the west. And the quality of those evenings was something Eva had no adequate language for, except that they were precisely what she had not let herself want for a very long time. She became pregnant in the fall of 1880, and when she told David, he was very still for a moment in the way that meant he was absorbing something important, and then he looked at her with such complete, uncomplicated happiness that she had to laugh. "A child," he said, as if checking that the word was real. "A child," she confirmed. He took her hands in both of his and held them. "You are all right?" he asked. "With this?" "I am more than all right," she said, and she meant it. She had not expected to want this. She had not let herself want it, in the years before David, because it had seemed like something that required the kind of stability and safety that she was not sure she could ever build. But now, in this house that they had built together, in Trinidad, in Colorado, with the Sangre de Cristo Mountains visible on the western horizon, and the creek running through the lower quarter, and Tuesday the cow in the barn, it felt not like a weight but like a completion. Their son was born in June of 1881, on a warm, clear morning, with the smell of the garden coming through the open bedroom window. He was healthy and loud and had his father's dark eyes and his mother's evident assessment of the world around him. They named him James, for James Webb, the man David had failed to save and had never stopped honoring. And for the first time in his life, David Stone wept openly, quietly, sitting in the chair beside his wife's bed with his newborn son in his arms. Eva watched him and felt the full, enormous breadth of the life they had built in the 2 years since they had left Caldwell together, the life she had nearly not allowed herself to have, the life that had required her to stop running and let herself be chosen. She reached out and touched David's arm. "James," she said, trying the name. "James," he said, and looked up at her. Rosa Garcia's father wrote to Eva that summer. He had received her letter from Caldwell, the one she had left on the desk, and he had found Eva's new address through a forwarding arrangement Mrs. Potts had helpfully set up. He wrote in careful, precise Spanish, which Eva read without difficulty, and his letter said that Rosa was thriving. She had a new teacher now, a young woman from Kansas City, and Rosa spoke freely in class and had become known as the best reader of any child in the school, and she was doing well, and her father wanted Eva to know that. Eva wrote back. She and Rosa Garcia's father corresponded twice a year for the next several years, brief, warm letters that tracked Rosa's progress through school and eventually into a life of her own. It was one of the small, sustaining joys of Eva's life, knowing that what she had built in that Caldwell schoolroom had mattered beyond the walls of it. Mrs. Potts came to visit in the autumn of 1881, making the long journey from Caldwell to Trinidad on the stage, and arriving with several jars of preserved goods, and a determined cheerfulness that filled the house with warmth for 2 weeks. She held baby James with the practiced confidence of a woman who had held a great many babies, and she told David that he had done the right thing and that she had always known it. And she said it with such complete conviction that David accepted it without argument, which was not his usual response to unqualified praise. She told Eva, quietly, one afternoon while David was outside, that the school board in Caldwell had reversed its position on Eva within 2 months of her departure, when the full story of Marcus Holt's letters had become understood in its proper context, and that Mayor Briggs had written to say he was sorry to have hesitated, and that the community had rallied around Eva's memory in the particular way that communities do when they realize they were manipulated by an outsider. Eva received this information and sat with it for a moment. She was glad, because it meant the children she had taught were in a community that had been honest with itself about what had happened. But she was not bitter about the hesitation. She understood it. Small communities were governed by social mechanics that were often more powerful than individual will, and the people of Caldwell were not cruel, only human. "I do not blame them," she told Mrs. Potts. "I know you do not," said Mrs. Potts. "That is why you were a good teacher." The winter of 1881 was hard but manageable, and they came through it with the ranch intact and James healthy and the horses in good condition. In the spring, David left the freighting company and began farming the land more seriously, expanding the vegetable garden into a proper kitchen garden, adding a small apple orchard on the eastern slope that would take years to mature, but that he planted with the patient confidence of someone who had learned to think in long terms. He hired a hand, a young Mexican man named Felipe who had come up from New Mexico Territory looking for work, and who turned out to be one of the most capable people David had ever worked alongside. Felipe became part of the daily life of the Stone Ranch with a naturalness that felt right, and Eva made sure from the very beginning that he was paid fairly and treated with the same respect she expected David to extend to any person who worked with him, which David did without being asked, because that was who he was. James Stone grew. He was a strong, curious child who from the very beginning had an appetite for the world around him that reminded Eva pleasurably of herself, and reminded David of nobody he could exactly name, which meant, he decided, that James was his own person, and that was exactly right. He walked at 10 months and talked in full sentences at 2 years, and had opinions about everything he encountered, which his parents received with a mixture of amusement and genuine respect. In the spring of 1883, Eva told David she was pregnant again. This time she told him at breakfast, across the kitchen table, and he stood up and came around and pulled her up from her chair, and held her in a long, firm embrace that said everything he was not immediately saying. "Another child," he said. "Another child," she said. "We are becoming an institution." He laughed. She had always loved to make him laugh. Their daughter was born in November of 1883, in a snowstorm that sealed the ranch in white and made Trinidad feel very far away. The midwife made it with 10 minutes to spare, arriving on horseback through the snow with the particular determination of a woman who had delivered babies in worse conditions than this. The baby arrived in the late afternoon with the snow still falling outside the window, small and pink, and furiously emphatic about being in the world. They named her Clara. James, who was 2.5, regarded his sister with a caution that gradually, over the following weeks, converted to a fierce protectiveness that both his parents found charming and occasionally exhausting. Marcus Holt's trial on the federal fraud charges concluded in the spring of 1884. Eva learned of the verdict through a letter from a former colleague in St. Louis, a woman she had maintained sporadic contact with who had followed the proceedings. Holt was convicted on 4 counts and sentenced to 7 years. He was stripped of his primary business interests as part of the civil proceedings. He was, by every account, completely destroyed as a social and commercial force. Eva read the letter at the kitchen table with the morning light coming in and James building something noisy with wooden blocks in the next room and Clara asleep in her crib, and she sat for a long time with the letter in her hands. David came in from outside and saw her expression and sat down across from her. She handed him the letter. He read it. Then he set it down and looked at her. "It is finished," he said. "It is finished," she said. The weight of 3 years of fear and running, layered underneath 2 years of tentative relief, and then the settled security of life in Trinidad, all of it shifted in her chest when she said those words, and she pressed her hand flat against the table to anchor herself. "Eva," he said. She looked at him. The man who had said, without hesitation, without calculation, "I am coming with you." The man who had packed a wagon and resigned his badge and driven 11 days across the southern plains because he had decided she was worth crossing any distance for. "I want to tell you something," she said. "All right," he said. "When I walked into the jailhouse that day to tell you I was leaving, I had decided I was going to do it alone. I was absolutely certain that I was going to do it alone. I had been alone for so long that I could not imagine any other way of doing something difficult." She paused. "And then you said what you said, and I stood on the step of that jailhouse and I looked for the trap in it because that is what I had learned to do, look for the trap." "I know," he said. "There was no trap," she said. "No," he said. "You have never been a trap," she said. "You have been exactly what you appeared to be every single day, and I am not sure you understand what a remarkable thing that is." He was quiet for a moment. "You have been the same," he said finally. "We have been," she said. He reached across the table and took her hand, the gesture he had made 100 times, in jailhouses and on riverbanks and in front of justices of the peace and on the porch in the evening light. And she took it back. And they sat in the morning kitchen of their ranch house in Trinidad, Colorado, with the apple orchard growing outside and 2 children and a hand named Felipe and a cow called Tuesday, and the letter from St. Louis flat on the table between them. And everything that had tried to undo them was finally, completely, permanently over. The years that followed deepened and widened without losing any of their essential quality. The apple orchard matured and bore its first real fruit in 1886, the small, tart apples of a mountain orchard, and Eva preserved them in jars that lined the shelves of the cellar in satisfying rows. James started school in Trinidad in the fall of 1887, and immediately became the kind of student who asked too many questions for the teacher's comfort and too interesting questions for the teacher to dismiss, which Eva received with the private satisfaction of someone who recognized her own tendencies. Clara grew into a small, fierce, deeply intelligent girl who had her father's quality of patient stillness combined with her mother's directness, a combination that David said would make her either very formidable or very difficult, or, he amended, probably both. Clara had an affinity for animals that was specific and serious. By the age of 4, she was helping Felipe with the horses in a way that was genuinely useful, not child's play but real assistance, and the horses accepted her as a matter of course. Felipe married in the spring of 1888, a young woman named Conception from a family that had settled near Trinidad 10 years prior, and the wedding was celebrated at the Stone Ranch with food that Eva and Conception prepared together over 2 days, and music provided by a fiddler from town, and the particular warmth of a gathered community that had chosen each other. James gave a toast that he had written out carefully on paper, which was extremely funny and also genuinely sweet, and Clara danced with Felipe until she fell asleep on her feet, and David carried her inside. Eva stood on the porch in the spring evening, watching the gathering in the lantern-lit yard, and David came and stood beside her, and she leaned against his shoulder in the way she had come to love, the way it fit. "Happy?" he asked. "Profoundly," she said. "Good," he said. He put his arm around her, and they stood on the porch of the house they had built together, looking out at the gathering of people they had gathered to themselves, and the mountains to the west were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, and the smell of the apple orchard was on the air, and Eva Easton Stone, who had once packed a carpetbag in the night and run from everything that was trying to undo her, allowed herself to simply stand in what she had built and understand that it was real, and it was hers, and it was not going anywhere. She was 34 years old, and she had spent the first decade of her adult life surviving and the second building, and what she had built was a life, a full, complicated, beloved, irreplaceable life, with a man who had refused to let her face it alone. In the spring of 1890, Eva told David she was pregnant a 3rd time. He put down the tool he was holding and looked at her with that same open, uncomplicated happiness, and she thought, not for the first time, How extraordinary it was that a man could still be surprised and delighted by a thing when it was the third time, as if each new life were its own complete and astonishing miracle, which perhaps it was. "Are you all right?" He asked the same first question as always, the question that was really asking. "Are you well? Are you ready? Are you glad?" "I am wonderful," she said. "I am 46% more tired than I was at this point last time, but I am wonderful." He laughed. She had always loved to make him laugh. Their second son was born in the autumn of 1890, a large, healthy, red-faced baby who announced his arrival with a volume that startled the chickens in the yard. They named him Thomas. James, now 9, received his brother with the gravity of a young man taking on a serious responsibility. Clara, at 6, received him with the practical efficiency of someone who had already processed the information and moved on to implementation. The family of 5 settled into itself the way a living thing settles, with adjustments and negotiations, and the particular chaos of a house containing young children and also 2 adults who had both learned the hard way that you do not take the ordinary days for granted. David's hair went silver at the temples by the time he was 40, and Eva told him it suited him, and she meant it. She developed the specific kind of authority that comes to women who have built something real, the quiet certainty of a person who knows their own ground. She taught in Trinidad for 18 years in total, and in that time she shaped the education of more than 200 children, and some of them grew up to do remarkable things, and some of them simply grew up well, which was equally remarkable. She wrote to Rosa Garcia's father until the older man died in 1892, and then she wrote to Rosa directly, and Rosa Garcia, who had grown up and married and had children of her own in Caldwell, wrote back letters that were full of vivid, intelligent observation about the world, which surprised nobody who had known her at 10, sitting in the back of a Caldwell schoolroom with a slate in her hands and something to say. James Stone, at 17, announced that he intended to study law. He had been reading about the federal court system and was specifically interested in the intersection of law and justice in the expanding Western territories, an interest that his mother regarded with deep, private satisfaction, and his father regarded with the particular pride of a man who had served the law for years and knew its importance and its limits, and was glad to see it continue in a new form. Clara Stone, at 15, was already running a substantial portion of the ranch with a capability that exceeded many adults. She was also, by this point, the finest rider in the Trinidad area by common agreement, a fact that she accepted without great fanfare because she had never been interested in recognition, only in the thing itself. Thomas grew into a quiet, observant boy who collected rocks and could name the geological formations visible in the hills east of the ranch, and who had his father's quality of patient steadiness in a way that sometimes made Eva look at him and see, startlingly, a small version of the man she had married. The life went on. The orchard produced. The garden produced. The cattle numbered 23 by 1893. Felipe and Conception had 3 children of their own, who grew up alongside the Stone children with the easy intimacy of people who consider themselves family, without requiring a legal definition of the term. Eva turned 40 in 1895, and David was 43, and they sat on the porch on the evening of her birthday, with the mountains in the distance and a glass of the wine that a neighboring Italian family had brought them. And it was the same porch, and the same mountains and the same man, and somehow none of it had become ordinary in the way that you feared ordinary things would become invisible. It was still there, the fundamental feeling of it, the same quality she had felt on the bank of the Chicaskia River in Caldwell when he kissed her the first time, the quality of complete, unguarded presence. "Tell me something you have not told me," she said. It was a game they had been playing for years, occasional the finding of something new to say to a person you knew entirely. He thought about it. "When Reeves Doyle first came to Caldwell," he said, "the courier that Holt sent, I had a conversation with him before I made it clear he should leave." And Doyle said in the course of that conversation that he could not understand what Holt wanted with a woman who had clearly already made up her mind. He said it almost admiringly. He said you had the look of someone who had already decided everything. David paused, and I thought standing there that he was entirely right, and that there was nothing in the world more compelling than someone who had decided. Eva looked at him. The evening light was warm on his silver-templed hair, on the face she had looked at for 16 years and still found worth looking at. "You never told me that," she said. "No," he said. "I am telling you now." She reached over and took his hand on the arm of the chair between them, the gesture they had made 1,000 times and would make 1,000 more, in all the evenings still left to them. "I had decided," she said. "I had decided to leave forever." "I know," he said. "And then you said you were coming with me." "I know," he said, and the warmth in his voice was the same warmth it had always been, undiminished by time or familiarity, only deepened by it. The way a river deepens in the same channel year after year without ever losing its direction. She pressed her thumb against his knuckles, feeling the familiar rough terrain of his hand, the hand that had built the porch they were sitting on and the orchard that was now producing and the life that surrounded them on all sides, solid and real and continuously alive. "I am glad you came," she said. "So am I," he said. "Every day." The stars came out over the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and the night air was cool and smelled of the apple orchard, and the house behind them was lit and warm, and somewhere inside it Thomas was asleep with his collection of rocks, and Clara was reading by lamplight, and James was away at his studies and would be home for the summer, and Felipe was in his own house with Conception and their children, and the whole woven texture of the life they had made spread out around them in every direction. Eva Easton Stone sat on the porch of her house in Trinidad, Colorado, with her hand in her husband's hand, and she thought about the woman who had packed a carpetbag in the night and run from St. Louis, and the woman who had stood in front of a jailhouse deputy in Caldwell, Kansas, and said she was leaving forever and not coming back, and she thought about what it had taken and what it had cost and what it had become, and she found that she could hold all of it at once, the fear and the running and the hidden motives and the dark past, and the forced choice, and the ultimate sacrifice of the walls she had built, and the extraordinary, daily, irreplaceable gift of what was on the other side of those walls. She had spent a long time being very good at leaving. She had spent 16 years being very good at staying. Of the two, staying was harder and more beautiful and more entirely worth it than anything she had ever done. The mountains were dark shapes against the stars, and the night was quiet, and David Stone sat beside his wife in the evening air, and neither of them needed to say anything else, because some things, after enough time and enough truth and enough love, become simply the thing itself, present and complete and needing no further words to make them real.